It's always great to be here on a Monday morning. It's like everybody else is rushing off to work, but we here have this little moment of peace and serenity. It's great. And we're thinking about Jesus in the gospel. It's a time of great blessing. So we're continuing with our chapter in the book Signs of Change, and the chapter is on Jesus. It's just entitled Jesus, and it puts Jesus as a human being in sequence with the chapters beforehand, which are understood. They're examining the stories of the Bible from the historical and the meaning perspective, the history and the sign value, what it does to our minds to understand things. So, of course, when we began with the Exodus is not just a physical event of the Hebrews being set free from Egypt under the leadership of Moses, but it's a sign of God's intention to set the oppressed free. I mean, you read it both as an historical physical event and as a sign of the character of God and the character of revelation of what God is doing in the world. And the same thing applies all the way through. Even when you get to the book of Jonah, which is probably a made-up story, it's a fairy tale, like we were saying, but that is still part of that system, because how could you make up a fairy tale like that unless it's based upon the experience and the spirituality and the understanding of God that's rooted in the people's experience and in their lives and in the history. So the meaning of Jonah is connected to the whole history of the Hebrew and Jewish people. And it's this wonderful story of non-violence, of the people of Nineveh turning from their violence and God having compassion on them and trying to turn the heart of Jonah, who was a prophet, turn that prophet to the same way of looking at things, even though he himself had experienced such an incredible liberation, being saved from the depths of the ocean by the great sea monster, the fish that swallowed him and then spat him out, and he was safe and sound, and all the rest of it. This wonderful symbolism of God's ability to take us out of the depths of our human condition and change us into something marvelously new. So that's the sequence in which Jesus is placed. He's both historical and full of meaning. And of course, Jesus, above all, for us as Christians, is that. I mean, he's both a real human being in a real space and time, crucified under Pontius Pilate, and he's the one who is the light of our hearts and our world. He changes the meaning of our existence. So he is supremely that, history and meaning together. And when I say meaning, I mean, the word I use in the book is semiotics. It's just a sign that is obviously full of meaning. Jesus is a sign full of meaning. And we were talking about the temple just before we started, about his action in the temple and how people misinterpret that as Jesus at last eventually becoming angry and violent, turning things over and using a whip and all the rest of it. They completely miss that this is a sign. This is a very big sign full of meaning. They actually misinterpret the meaning, profoundly misinterpret the meaning. They reduce the meaning simply to violence, whereas it's anything but. Jesus is ending the system of violence by a powerful sign that includes the shutting down of the temple, but also includes the fact that he's going to get arrested as a result. I mean, that's the arc that we reconstruct from what he did in the temple is that we know he died. Why did he die? Well, it's most likely because he went to the temple, as the Gospels all tell us, and he shut things down temporarily, which really upset the authorities, and they decided that he had to die. It's what the Gospels of Mark and Matthew tell us. And it's, of course, we know just naturally that it's an extreme offense to interfere with a temple service, the conduct of a temple, any religious event, really, but especially a temple event, and especially the temple in Jerusalem, which had so much history and really crisis packed into it. It's the only thing holding the Jewish world together. So when Jesus interferes with that, he threatens the order, the established order, and of course, anybody, as we know from our own American history, like Martin Luther King, anybody who threatens the established order runs a very, very grave risk of being put to death. So it's a natural sequence. But so we have to understand what got Jesus put to death was meaning, not a bad temper fit. It was something that he intended. It's something that he meant. Excuse me. And we have to see it that way, the arc of history and meaning. So we carry on, and we're going to look today at two. We're backing up now from his death, the action in the temple, to his previous ministry, and we're going to look at two features of that ministry. One connected to John the Baptist, and the other connected to his use of the story of Jonah, and see how there is an inherent nonviolence in those episodes and those relationships that are depicted there. And so we're going to develop that picture, that kind of photo fit of Jesus that we're getting from his death, the action of the temple, and then we backtrack deeper into his life, going back to his story, and see how he's already moving very much in that direction. He's speaking and understanding his life in that direction as a profound revelation of divine nonviolence. And just to underline what we're doing here, we're not simply basing our Christian faith on a reconstruction of Jesus' historical pathway, even though it's very important to do that, and it's unavoidable to do that because he's a real historical person in a real historical situation. There's no way you're not actually going to have to give some account of his life. But we're not basing our Christian faith simply on that. Because why? Because faith comes from our relationship with the Holy Spirit. It comes from an awakening inside us of a relationship with God through the Holy Spirit. And all of us have experienced that in one way or the other. And we know that the Spirit, as Paul says, that when we are too weak to pray, we don't even know what to pray for, the Spirit comes to our aid and prays and speaks within our depths and teaches us the things of God and how to pray. So the Spirit is a testimony inside us. It's a witness. It's a witness to the truth of what we're talking about. And unless you have that witness, you can't have the strength, I don't think, to be a Christian in the way we're talking about. Because being a Christian is something that goes against the world. It goes against our embedded human reaction to things. It goes against our normal violent response in every situation, or at least competitive and mimetic, to put somebody else first, as the New Testament teaches us, to to be the servant of others, that's not natural. It doesn't come instinctively to us. What comes instinctively is to put myself first and to make sure that I come out on top. And all sports and all entertainment basically is based on coming out on top. So putting yourself second so that you're actually underneath somebody, you have to have the spirit to do that. And it has to be the Spirit of God. You have to feel, you have to know that this is the true meaning of life. And it belongs to the nature of the universe itself. That embedded at the depth of everything is this nonviolence and love of God. God self puts God second. He puts creation first and puts himself or herself second in order that creation might be. Our life is a testimony that God is a servant to us, because we are free. We can be who we are. We are sent out into life independent in our hearts in many ways. So it's a testimony of God releasing us and setting us free to choose and to be free, and ultimately to choose life and love, which is what we understand as the meaning of our Christian faith. So that's the point, is that we're Christians through the testimony of the Holy Spirit that teaches us to serve, to love, to forgive. But once we see the facts of life, the facts of Jesus' story as one with that, as showing that pattern himself, teaching that pattern and breaking that pattern into the world, it reinforces and strengthens our faith enormously. And the two things go together. I mean, after all, if you have a violent understanding of God, that God requires the punishment of his son, and then at the same time you think you're taught, well, you should forgive your enemy because that's what the gospel says. You should serve others, like Martha does and Mary does. You should put yourself second. Why should you do that if God himself doesn't do that? If God says, I am angry and I'm the most important one here, I'm God, and I'm going to beat somebody up, and if it has to be my son, I'm going to beat him up. Just so I can come out on top. It makes no sense. It makes no sense that we should be asked to love our enemies, to serve others, if God doesn't do that. But of course, God does in Jesus, which what we see in Jesus, this is what we're showing. God absolutely does do that. That's what God is the first one to do that. And when Jesus is on the cross, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know what they do. He's teaching us that the Father is like him at that moment, not holding people's offenses against them, not retaliating, not abusing. He's abused, he did not abuse in return, that kind of thing. So the pathway that we're describing here from the gospel is one that fits with the testimony of the Spirit in our hearts in favor of forgiveness, love, and nonviolence. And therefore, it's a much more coherent teaching and catechesis, I believe. It actually fits much better than what we've probably heard before in many ways. So that's important to bear in mind. It's kind of what we're doing. So unless anybody's got anything they want to say, we can now turn to John the Baptist. So John the Baptist is this amazing person in the Gospels who is, out of anybody there, any of the characters in the Gospel, the one who can claim most of all to have been a teacher and a mentor to Jesus himself. In other words, who did Jesus learn from in the Gospels? The person, the figure that can claim that the most is John the Baptist. And so it's a very, very significant role in the Gospels. that Jesus, to some degree, followed in John the Baptist's footsteps. So let's read something from the Gospels to show this. First of all, we're going to read from John's Gospel, chapter 3. If we look at that first. Chapter 3, 22 to 23, if someone has got that. John's Gospel, chapter 3, 22 to 23. Would someone like to read that? Thank you, Kathy. If Kathy would read that, and Maggie's going to turn you on now, I think you're good.
After this, Jesus and disciples went out into the Judean countryside, where he spent some time with them and baptized. Now John also was baptizing at Aenon near Salem, because there was plenty of water and people were constantly coming to be baptized.
Okay, so what is that a picture of? What, I mean, just a little snapshot. What does that tell us as a little story there?
That they were embracing baptism.
They were embracing baptism, and who was baptizing?
John.
John and
Jesus.
Right, absolutely. It tells us that Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he spent some time there with them and baptized. So it tells us that Jesus practiced the same ministry as John the Baptist. John, who is called the Baptist, he started baptism.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus didn't start baptism. Jesus went to John and got baptized in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. They all show Jesus getting baptized by John. John starts the ministry of baptism. And in this passage here in John's Gospel, John the Evangelist's Gospel, we see that Jesus followed and practiced the same ministry as John the Baptist. Now, what does that suggest about the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus at this point?
Well, if he's following in his footsteps, he definitely is very close to him. He's his mentor.
Yep.
Yeah, very. He's realizing this is the right thing to do, baptism, and he is proceeding with John to carry this.
So John, at this point, would be described as the mentor and even the master of Jesus, because he's the one who started the ministry. If you follow on in somebody's footsteps to do what they do, then you are at least the person who is leading you is the person who started it. So Jesus is, shall we say, is being led by John the Baptist here. Now that is a bit of a scandal in the Gospels, because Jesus is eventually become so important that they kind of find it difficult, especially in John's Gospel, the one we read here, even though it does report that he baptized. If we look at chapter 4, you can see there's a little bit of a stress there. If we just go over to the next chapter, Kathy, and you read chapter 4, verses 1, 2, 3. Again, just a short snippet.
Okay, chapter 4, 1 through 3.
Yeah, right.
Okay. The Pharisees heard that Jesus was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. When the Lord learned of this, he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. One more?
No, that's great. Now, what does that little passage tell us, Kathy, or suggest to us?
Now the disciples are baptizing.
Right. So it says, when they learned that Jesus was making and baptizing, it just says Jesus was making and baptizing disciples. It just says he was the one baptizing, exactly as the earlier passage in chapter 3 said. It then goes on and puts a little parenthesis in there, which actually contradicts it and says, no, the disciples were baptizing. Although it was not Jesus himself, but his disciples were baptized. Now, why would they do that? Why would the text go, the actual text? It's like you saying, well, I went for a drive yesterday with my husband. Actually, no, I didn't. Now, wait, what is true? Did you go for a drive with your husband or didn't you? And here it says he was baptizing, then it says, no, the disciples were baptizing. Now, why would it do that? Why would so because you've got to think this is a manuscript, this is a series of writings, probably edited by different hands until you finally get the final product. Why would the editor put in that little side note, that parenthesis saying, oh, actually, it was the disciples who were baptizing? When before it just said Jesus was baptizing. Just to get you can see this relationship they've got. Jesus, John the Baptist is being led by Jesus. Then Jesus, now at this point, goes to Galilee. He breaks from the ministry of the Jordan, but the text tells us that he was not baptizing. It suggests that there's this kind of anxiety. There's an anxiety in the tradition to recognize that Jesus actually was a disciple and a follower of John the Baptist at one time, because they want to exalt Jesus, and of course Jesus does eventually become very exalted. It kind of finds it difficult to deal with the story, the actual history, that at some point Jesus was a follower and disciples. How can he rise so high if at one point he was below John the Baptist? But that's what the text seems to be telling us, that at one point Jesus was a disciple and a follower of John the Baptist, and then he separated from him. Go ahead, Maggie. We can't hear you. Go ahead.
I think I'm confused about was this after then Jesus was baptized?
Well, that's another strange thing, because the Gospel of John does not report the baptism of Jesus. It's the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that report the baptism. But we have to assume that it was after that Jesus was baptized, because if Jesus is baptizing, then it assumes that he already went through the experience and thought it was a good thing that other people engaged in, and then he himself followed on, precisely because it's like if something good, like if you come to the Beth Fest or something like that and say, oh, we had a great time. Next time we have a Beth Fest, you'll invite other people. That's Jesus is inviting other people into the same experience. So the assumption is that Jesus is already baptized, although the Gospel of John does not report this. Why? Because it has this anxiety. How can Jesus be so exalted if at one time he was kind of basically underneath John the Baptist? And this is all part of Jesus' own story. So if we think, and we reconstruct it here, that at one point Jesus was a disciple, a follower of John the Baptist, but then, like it just says there, what Kathy read, he left Judea and started back to Galilee, and then he begins his ministry in Galilee, beginning in later on in the chapter, when he came to Cana in Galilee. He pursues his ministry there. What was it that led Jesus to begin a separate ministry and to stop baptizing? I mean, at some point he go ahead, Maggie.
I'm assuming it's because at this point, Jesus understands his path. So
Right.
he needs to divert, because, John the Baptist was more about taking down the Romans in more of a physical way. And Jesus obviously was about nonviolence. So he had to kind of separate himself from that path.
Well, that's a very powerful insight, Maggie, and I think it's correct that Jesus separates himself from John the Baptist on the issue of violence. Now, we've never really thought that in the past, and we've never really been taught it, because the whole issue of violence was not central to Christian teaching and thought. Basically, what we were taught was that John the Baptist was there. He had this job of pointing to Jesus. He was the forerunner. Says, one who come after me, whose shoes I'm not worthy whose sandals are not worthy to tie. So John the Baptist points to Jesus ahead of him as someone who's greater than him. And John's gospel definitely has that. He says, when the bridegroom comes, then the bride will go to the bridegroom, and he says, he must increase and I must decrease. And John's gospel is the gospel of the writer John, is full of that, is full of how John the Baptist is saying Jesus is greater than him. But there had to be a point, if you're going back to the actual history. So when you write the Gospels, you're writing about Jesus crucified, dead, and risen, and you already believe he's the risen Lord. But right back there at the beginning, when Jesus is just starting, there has to be the point where Jesus does look very much like a disciple of John the Baptist, and is a disciple of John the Baptist, and separates himself from John the Baptist. And so there's another question there. Why does he separate himself from John the Baptist? What's the reason? Is it because I am just greater than John the Baptist? Of course not. He doesn't even really clearly know that at that time. There's something that is an issue for Jesus between him and John the Baptist. Now, this is not to denigrate John the Baptist at all. It's not to, because we all of us would have an issue with Jesus, or Jesus would have an issue with us. We're all struggling on this pathway. But go ahead, Kathy. Kathy wants to say something.
Well, John the Baptist was looking for somebody like Elijah that's going to,
right,
take care of the Romans.
Right.
He's going to be the king. The only way we know is we got to get, we have to use the violence to,
yes,
as past. And Jesus is, this is not Jesus's message.
No, absolutely.
Even though he's his teacher. It's kind of interesting how he evolved into this.
Yes.
Since John was his teacher, his mentor, and now I guess he's just realizing that this is not the point. The whole point is nonviolence. The whole point is don't live this way. But this is not how I'm going to accomplish.
That's very, very, very profound point, Kathy, and it reinforces. I mean, once we get that point, it reinforces then how we did describe what he was doing in the temple. He was bringing to an end the violent mechanics of the temple, because it followed through with his whole understanding of his life as the revelation of God's nonviolence. So this, as we've backtracked into his life from those final episodes of the temple and the arrest and the crucifixion, we backtrack into his life. This supports the whole picture the whole pattern that we're developing here. So if we go to now, it's not just supposition that this was the grounds of Jesus's break from John the Baptist. We have an actual text in the Gospels which tells us this. If we go to Matthew chapter 11, verses 7 to 19, we learn an awful lot from there. So we go from Matthew chapter 11, verses 7 to 19, if someone would read that for us. Matthew 11, 7 to 19. Well, actually, you could begin with verse 2. I'm sorry, yes, probably it's 2 to 19. Go ahead, Maggie, please. Go ahead.
Matthew chapter 11, starting at 2.
Yes.
When John heard in prison what the Messiah was doing, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense to me." As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to look at? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? Someone dressed in soft robes? Look, those who wear soft robes are in royal places. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John came, and if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. Let anyone let anyone with ears listen. But to what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in a marketplaces and calling to one another. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds.
Thank you, Maggie. Well, that's a very rich passage, and it's got a lot of things packed in there. But it's all to do with the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus. So it shows you, that passage, that there is a very intense relationship between them. And there's nothing comparable in the Gospels. There's no other person that Jesus comments on or describes the connection and the contrast between him and that person. So John the Baptist is, it's not just that John was a baptizer and Jesus was baptized and baptized along with John. There is this commentary by Jesus himself about the figure of John the Baptist and about their relationship. And right at the heart of it there, the bit that she read and that we'll come back to, it says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. Now, the suggestion is well, I would take that as a very polite and a bleak way of Jesus saying John the Baptist has preached a violent message. He's preached the kingdom of God, which is what I take baptism as signifying, is this breakthrough into another world, which is what I think John the Baptist was signifying. But he talked about it, he preached it in terms of violence. And if you go back to Luke's gospel, I mean, we're going to go back there to Matthew in a moment, but go back to Luke's gospel and read the account of John's preaching in Luke's gospel, then that actually vindicates what we just said there. If we look at chapter 3 of Luke's gospel and read verses 7 to 9, what does that sound like? If someone would read that, Luke chapter 3, verses 7 through 9.
John said to the crowds that came out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bear fruits worthy of repentance. Do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our ancestor,' for I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Even now, the axe is laid at the root of the trees, and every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire."
All right.
Okay?
Yes, that's right. Very good. Thank you. That is fiery preaching. It doesn't sound like Jesus, does it? Jerry, I didn't hear that. You were muted. Go on.
Hellfire preaching.
It is. The images are violent. Vipers, fire, axe. You know, that's the spirit that John the Baptist has. And we recognize it immediately. It doesn't sound like Jesus. It's not the spirit of Jesus. So we already have evidence there in the preaching that John the Baptist was not like Jesus in that respect, even though he did preach the kingdom of God. I mean, that Jesus says that from the days of John the Baptist, the kingdom of God has essentially been preached, but it's been taken by force. The violent have taken it by force. Who else is Jesus talking about there? Is he talking about the Romans? Is he talking about the priests in the temple? But he's talking about John. So that's the issue that Jesus has with John the Baptist, and that's why he leaves the ministry at the Jordan and goes to Galilee instead. He separates himself from John's ministry. Now then, if we go back to that passage in Matthew, we see that poor old John is in prison and he has a bit of a problem, because he was expecting the heavens to open and the end to come. And he's in prison, and Herod is still in charge. The Romans are still in charge. Nothing has happened. So he's signaling to Jesus that I'm rather disappointed in you, Jesus. Are you really the one who is to come? Now, when he talks about the one who is to come, there's another clue there. Because normally we as Christians think about the Messiah, the Christ. And the passage in Matthew there actually kind of leads you in that direction, because it talks about the Christ, and then it has John ask that question. But the one who is to come in John's language is not Christ, not the Christ. because the Christ, in technical terms, is the Messiah. That is the anointed one, the son of David. That is a king who, in the minds of everybody at the time, would have been a military leader who would have found a way to defeat the Romans militarily. Now that was the popular concept of the Christ, of the Messiah. Of course, Christianity changed that. So when we talk about the Christ, now we have Jesus, the suffering servant, as fulfilling that role. And I think I personally obviously think that is the true Messiah. But going back to that point, the Christ was not that, and was a military leader. And John himself was not talking in those terms. He was talking about the one who is to come from the prophecy of Malachi. Now, if we look at the book here on page 100, the easiest way to reference it is the page 154. Sorry, 153. We start there at the bottom. We get the explanation of that language of one who is to come, and we know this. Is what's at stake, because the disciples themselves say, should not Elijah come first before the end? When Jesus is coming down off the mountain of transfiguration, shouldn't Elijah come? And Jesus says, yes, Elijah has come, and it's John the Baptist. So the issue is Elijah, not the Christ. Elijah is the one who's going to come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So it's another scenario. This is not the scenario of a Davidic Messiah leading a rebellion against the Romans. This is a quite different scenario. This is a scenario of the Lord God breaking through the great and terrible day of the Lord, the day of fire. And that day will be prepared for by the figure of Elijah. So it's a different biblical apocalyptic scenario that is not the simple scenario of David defeating the Philistines or something, because everybody would know that nobody's going to defeat the Romans. They actually did try it, and they had a terrible war. And eventually, of course, the Romans won, and they won decisively. And anybody with any sense would know that. So if you're going to defeat the Romans, or if you're going to change the world situation, you need something much more powerful than that. You need the day of the Lord, and you need Elijah to come and prepare you for it. So that's what John the Baptist is referring to when he says, are you the one who's to come? Are you Elijah? Because you're not acting like Elijah. So let's read this now on page 153, which will help. I mean, you can go back to Malachi in the scriptures yourself to look at it, but this summarizes it. So I'm in the second full paragraph there. The phrase, the one who is to come, is often understood in a default Christian manner as the expected Messiah, Christ. But it's important to know that an expected Messiah was just one of the scenarios of how God could intervene in the current crisis of Jerusalem and Judea, and not a terribly plausible one, as it normally implied an actual Davidic military king would be able to lead a successful attack against the Romans. Much more attractive was the scene presented in the prophecy of Malachi. So Malachi is the last prophet in the Bible, the last of the minor prophets. It comes at the end, and the Christian scriptures is just before Matthew. It's before the beginning of the New Testament. So you can read these passages there. The prophecy of Malachi in chapter 4, of the day of the Lord, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all evildoers will be stubble, the day that comes shall burn them up. Now that sounds like John's preaching. They'll be thrown into the oven. It sounds directly out of Malachi. It is the unleashing of direct divine power against which even the might of Rome must quail. A core part of Malachi's prophecy was the coming of a messenger. Indeed, he is coming, chapter 3, verse 1, just one chapter before that final prophecy there, to prepare the way, a figure who is subsequently identified with Elijah. Lo, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So that completes the scenario. There's going to come this terrible day which will burn up the evildoers. It's a day of fire which will actually physically burn the evildoers. So you don't have to worry about the Messiah, the Davidic Messiah, because there's this fire going to be unleashed from heaven and is going to burn all those people whom you hate. Now, we all like that scenario. That's a wonderful scenario. Fire from heaven, burning up all the bad people. And I know that I'm not going to be burned because I have been baptized in the River Jordan by John the Baptist. I'm one of the good guys on the good side, and I'm going to be ready for Elijah when he comes. And I'm going to be one of his gang, not one of the crowd of evildoers who are going to be fried like chips, like crisps from heaven. Because God is finally decided, God has got off his throne. I mean, what a scenario. The day of the great and terrible day of the Lord. The God has finally got, I said, I can't stand it anymore. I'm going to burn up these guys, you know. That's what John is talking about, poor guy. Even though, and Jesus says, I respect him enormously, but it's violent. And it's not the way that I choose. So it is this prophecy much more likely lies behind John's unhappy question. So John's question, are you the one who is to come? The crucial role of the Elijah figure is underlined in Jesus' own conversation with the disciples at chapter 17 of Matthew, where the coming Elijah is plainly identified by Jesus to be John the Baptist himself. So Jesus says, yes, the prophecy is fulfilled. John is Elijah, but I am something different. And he who has ears should listen to me and should believe in me. So there is a very big difference between John, in actual kind of physical, kind of historical terms. I mean, like we gloss it over in the kind of pious storytelling of the saints kind of account that we give. But if you go back to that point, there would have been a lot of tension. And Jesus had to do that. He had to leave the Jordan and go to Galilee. He had to start in some separate place and separate himself, even though he respected John the Baptist a lot. He says, of those born of women, none is greater than he is, because he opened the way. But the least in the kingdom of heaven, the very most insignificant person who accepts my preaching of the kingdom of basically blessed are the poor, blessed are the bleak, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the non-violent. That's Jesus' version of the kingdom. The very least who accepts that is greater than John the Baptist. So Jesus draws this division, this line. It's a very powerful line between everything up to now, which has relied on the mechanics, the anthropology of violence, shall we say, the way in which the world is constructed out of violence, which is relied on that, is less than the least person in this other way. So that's the way Jesus talks, the way he looks at things, and what he's constructing that would lead him all the way through to the temple and then the crucifixion. So just to read a little bit more about Elijah here now on page 154. Elijah did not suffer opposition meekly. He is famous for ordering the slaughter of the prophets of Baal. I mean, if you want a hero from the Old Testament who brings down fire directly from heaven, it's Elijah. After summoning heavenly fire on his holocausts, also gratuitously calling down fire on 2 companies of soldiers sent to be his escort to the king. He just fried these soldiers because he was in a bad mood. there were platoons of 50 soldiers each, and he struck them with lightning, man. I mean, because he didn't like the king, and he didn't like anybody contacting him from the king. I mean, Elijah, he didn't want to get him on a good day, let alone a bad day, you know. So Elijah is not a model for Jesus. Jesus politely sidelines Elijah, and he chooses instead as his prophetic model Jonah. Not Elijah, but Jonah. Jonah, who had a very bad mood himself, but was saved by the fish from the depths of violence, from the depths of the human condition, spewed up on the shore, preached to the Ninevites, and they turned from their violence and they turned from their evil ways, and God did not bring about the punishment that would. So it's obviously a different modeling. You know, it's not, Jesus politely declines the Elijah model, and instead when we'll read that before we finish, he advances or proposes the Jonah model. I just finished it here. Thus, the coming of Elijah's scenario is by far the most plausible understanding of John's words, and it is one that Jesus rebuts with his very different version of the way of the Lord in the world. Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor. These are all non-violent things, you know. They're actually the reversal of violence. They're the undoing of violence in human life, you know. Any physical impact on you that is violent it's going to have some health impact. And he says all these things have been, and even the dead are raised. It would be hard to imagine a more contrasting to-do list to the threatened one of burning. All of Jesus's list is drawn from the biblical prophecy, especially Isaiah, and it amounts to a diametrically alternative biblical code to John's tropes of fiery divine intervention, in which case we must understand Jesus as having made a profoundly different judgment as to the nature of God's return to Zion. This is not going to happen by fire. This is going to happen instead by the Son of Man who suffers. It's a completely different scenario. If John was preparing for a day of conflagration of enemies, Jesus was to bear their assaults with forgiveness. So this understanding shows us clearly that the issue on which Jesus diverged from John the Baptist, which is evident that he did, the issue on which he diverged from John the Baptist was the issue of divine violence, which John the Baptist was invoking, the terrible fire of the day of the Lord, and Jesus was saying, no, there is a completely different pathway, which is that of the Son of Man who suffers in order to bring about the kingdom of God and to bring a radical change in the way human beings are. So it's not just tit for tat, you know, like, okay, you human beings are bad, you're sinners. Okay, well, God is angry, he's going to destroy you, destroy the sinner. That's the easy way, so long as you're on the good side. But who knows whether you're on the good side or not, you know? Much, much, much more profound and attractive is this revelation by Jesus of God, who does not do that. In fact, God is totally different. God enters into a relationship of nonviolence with you, which changes your whole way of being. So we just read a little bit on page 155, and I can stop there to ask you what you think. So just going into that remark that he makes in chapter 11 about the violent taking it by storm, this is the only explanatory remark that we have about why Jesus and John the Baptist are different. from the days of John the Baptist until now, and violence is the crucial feature which governs everything in this frame. Thus, from the days of John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence or has been violated. There's a possible alternative translation, but it doesn't make it really any difference. The following phrase, "and the violent take it by force," can go with both translations, but either way it makes plain that those who are violent are taking over or hijacking God's kingdom and its meaning. This is the key. Violence as a theme and activity violates the kingdom. It possesses the kingdom in a way that is alien to the kingdom itself. The rest of the passage goes on pointedly to underline the continuity of meaning between John and the law and the prophets, also naming John as the Elijah who is to come. He is Elijah. He follows in that way. Jesus has drawn a seismic distinction between his preaching and John, and much of the tradition before him. In the substantive context of the Baptist, there can be little doubt Jesus is here indicating violence as the core phenomenon which separates him from the Baptist. As far as Jesus is concerned, John hijacked the kingdom with his violent apocalyptic. And he says it in a polite way, and he has a lot of respect for John the Baptist. But essentially, Jesus says John hijacked the kingdom. And that is the kind of thing you'd expect a real prophet to say, you know, to make clear what's really at stake. What do you guys think? As I pause to blow my nose. Dana, go ahead.
Well, through all the whole study that we've been doing, it's like, okay, we're here at the spotlight, like for me, there's no other way to argue. I feel like I don't want to be so black and white, but there's no other way to see this. Because what would you say about John? What is the difference between John the Baptist and Jesus?
Right.
It's so clear. It just seems so clear. So this is such an exciting study. It's like, I love that first one that was read, Matthew 11, 2 through 9.
Yeah.
Oh my God, every word here. And this is what we're building to. Not like, because folks will say, but what about this in the Bible and that in the Bible? But this is what we're building to. We're building to the story of Jesus. So
right, exactly right.
We're building
exactly right. And Jesus draws the line of distinction. No one pays attention to that Jesus is drawing this line of distinction.
That's so beautiful. It's so clearly drawn. And really that's the line.
Yeah. Now, I mean, but Jesus is gentle and polite about it because he doesn't like drawing lines as like, you're the bad guy, John, you're the bad guy, and I'm the good guy. I mean, he has to
show us the way, right?
That's right. He has to show us the way. That's right.
But abundantly, it comes back. So he's showing us the way with this language, with action.
That's exactly right, Dana. He is showing us the way. Kathy.
Just think it's when you stop to think about it, John's position, he's Jesus's mentor. He is, beginning in the beginning of his ministry. And then you think as Jesus is a human and God, at what point does Jesus say, whoa, let's stop for a minute, because this is not the way this is not going to be the transformation. This is not going to be the way of that is going to be taught, that you do bad, you use the military to take care of it, use violence, you rise up this way. But it's just interesting when I look at it as here's John the Baptist, and he really looked to him so highly, and then the transition, how it evolves, how it all evolves.
Right. So you say I can imagine that. It doesn't describe it in detail, but there's some point at which Jesus says, hang on here.
Yeah.
This is not what I'm about, or what the Father is about.
Right.
So this and John the Baptist must have struggled with that. He must have said, well, you know, Jesus is he definitely thinks Jesus is important, incredibly important, but he sees Jesus as not fulfilling that scenario of fire from heaven. And then Jesus replies to him, but well, tell him what you do see. You know, the lame walk, the blind see, the poor have the good news preached to them. You know, I want you, John, to come into that other way of seeing things and doing things. He's inviting. He says, blessed are you who's not scandalized in me. So it's very possible to be scandalized in Jesus, because his way is not the usual way, and it's not the normal way. I think Christianity permanently, I think Christians are always scandalized in Jesus, because they much prefer him. You know, okay, Jesus, yeah, you were kind, you forgave the sinner, but you're going to come back at the end, and there's going to be this terrible day of the Lord. It's going to burn everybody out. So that's being we're the same as John. We're being scandalized in Jesus's way. And that means to say we're not following his way. We're not showing it in the world, you know. And so John the Baptist is very important in the gospel as a foil. You see, I mean, like in dramatic terms, in literary terms, John the Baptist is and Peter, the disciple, is also a foil. There's all these people who are foils for Jesus, because it's hard to understand his way, and you have to see it in contrast with these others. Go ahead, Maggie.
Also, I think it's brilliant that it looks to me now too that Jesus was trying to teach the good news that's in the Old Testament.
Right.
Because it seems to me now that John the Baptist was kind of showing us what humanity is, and how
Right.
they want to take control of the situation with violence.
Right.
And then Jesus comes and tries to teach us that, within the Torah, there's the different view of God. God is nonviolent in the Old Testament.
Yeah, in
Look at
Genesis.
Jonah.
Yeah. In Genesis, the story is of Joseph forgiving his brothers and loving on the Egyptians, basically.
Exactly. So Jesus was trying to teach way back then that God wasn't violent in the Old Testament. And I think that's just brilliant.
It is brilliant. And the Bible itself is this great conversation with itself. I mean, that's what you have to see the Bible. The Bible isn't just one flat, unilateral statement, which of course always ends up violent, because that itself is violent, just to say there's one version. And the natural response of human beings, their interpretive lens, is violent. So they just read those bits that are violent, where God throws all the Egyptians into the sea, and he calls down fire on people in the people who offended him in Numbers, in the book of Numbers, etc., etc. They pick out those bits, but actually it's the Bible is showing us a conversation between the most fundamental responses of human beings. If there is injustice, if there's wickedness, yes, the natural response is, let's wipe it out.
Well, I really appreciate this section, because it really touches my heart that even Jesus wanted us to see how loving God was back then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome. So now we go actually finish with Jonah, and that reinforces. So we've worked our way back from the death, through the temple, through the teaching on John the Baptist, and there's this other teaching on Jonah, which I think stands in contrast. You've got to put John the Baptist and Elijah and Jonah together. They are kind of contrasting images that helps clarify what Jesus is doing. So if we look at Luke chapter 11 verses 29 to 32, this is another key passage, explanatory passage. So we look at Luke chapter 11 29 to 32. If someone would like to read that. Go ahead, Kathy. Please read that.
As the crowds increased, Jesus said, "This is a wicked generation. It asks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was a sign to the Ninevites, so also the Son of Man will be to this generation. The Queen of the South will rise at the judgment with the men of the generation and condemn them. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom. And now one greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now one greater than Jonah is here."
There you go. So now if you put this side by side with the whole John the Baptist and Elijah thing, you can understand it better. He says, this generation is an evil generation. It asks for a sign. Now, if you're John the Baptist, or you're followers of John the Baptist, the kind of sign you're thinking of, what was Elijah's greatest sign? The one that really showed God on his side. Jerry, I can't hear you. I'm sure you've got the answer there, but I can't hear you.
Fire from heaven.
That's right, fire from heaven, burning up the Holocaust. So Elijah declares this contest with the prophets of Baal. And he says, okay, you have your Holocaust, you have your sacrifices there, and I have my sacrifices to Yahweh. Now, I'm going to cover all my sacrifices. I'm going to douse it all in water. So, it's all soaked with water. Nothing can burn if there's water. But I'm going to pray to God to send fire from heaven to burn up these holocausts. And then you can pray to your God and see whether your God will burn. And of course, we all know how the story ends. The fire comes from heaven, burns up Yahweh's holocausts, and the prophets of Baal, they just stay there, like nothing moves. There's no fire. It's very, very embarrassing for them. And of course, he has them all put to death. They all have their throats cut. I mean, it's very, very violent. And that's the kind of sign, if John the Baptist was preaching Elijah, that's the kind of sign the people were expecting. So Jesus says, this is an evil generation because it's expecting a violent sign. That's what's evil. But then he doesn't say, well, and God is going to wipe you out as a result. He says, a sign will be given to you. The sign of Jonah. Now, Jonah is a very, very un-Elijah. I mean, if fire comes from heaven with Elijah, Jonah is down in the depths of the ocean where no fire can possibly burn, like he's just there in the depths. So Jesus Jesus' imagination is great. And I mean, the way he thinks the language through, thinks the symbolism and the semiotics through. The sign that you're going to get is not far from heaven. It's going to be a prophet in the depths. And the people who are hearing him would say, well, what kind of sign is that? We didn't get the sign. That was a sign for the Ninevites. And Jesus says, yes, that's the sign I'm talking about, because the men and women of Nineveh, they repented. That's what I'm talking about. I'm looking outside of Israel. I'm looking outside for where there's an example of a transformation, and it comes in the story of Jonah. So Jesus uses the story of Jonah as his alternative language, his alternative prophet. I mean, Elijah's the kind of kick-butt prophet that we all respect. Jonah is not a kind of prophet you respect very much. I mean, like, he's running away. He doesn't want to do what he's asked to do. He's in a bad mood permanently, except for that little bit where he's in the where he's in the whale, in the fish, and he's desperate, and he prays out, and he seems, he has a nice prayer there, but he's still, then he reverts to his bad mood. He's not a kind of prophet that you could, why a sign of Jonah, Jesus? Can't you get someone a little bit more, cool than that? Maggie, go ahead.
Isn't it kind of like the story of us as individuals in a way? Because, when you feel like God is asking you to go out there and do something loving, or what he's asked, whatever God, she is asking you to do, and you just keep avoiding it. And
Yeah,
then
right.
finally, God leads you to that point where you do it. Sometimes I feel like that's what God is doing to me, because I put
Right.
myself in that dark, deep place, but then the Lord helps me get out of it, and then I go ahead and do what God wanted me to do.
Right. Well, that's right. I mean, and so there's always that learning as well, that we can refuse, but then God will come after us, really. Like he comes after Jonah to make sure that he does his job, and then
I think humans can relate to that.
Yeah, and he intercedes with Jonah. He says, please don't be angry with these people. There's 120,000 people in that city, and not to mention the animals, and you want me to destroy them? And you're all upset about your little bush. Go ahead, Kathy.
Jonah is like us, like, come on, this is not, they haven't behaved, and and I can't put up with this. This is not the way things are taken care of, to the extent of running away from God, and then God is so gentle with him, leading him, keeping him safe in the belly of the whale, leading him to see the way. But it's just, I feel Jonas is just like us. We don't, our first reaction is like, boy, they, I wish that they would get taken care of.
Right. Take care. That's right.
I don't know if I'm going to do it or not, but I'm kind of hoping that they get set straight,
Right.
But Jonah was so convicted that he's running from God.
Yes, that's right. Yes, you're right.
And to see this beautiful, beautiful example of forgiveness.
That's right.
The way.
I mean, you're absolutely right that Jonah, he says, I know that you're a merciful God. You're a forgiving God. I know that. That's why I ran away. I mean, it's not Jonah's not confused. He's not stupid. He knows exactly what's at stake. And he says, that's the reason I'm running away. I don't want to have to do this. I don't want this your loving, kind stuff poured out on the Ninevites. I want them to be burnt to death. That's what I want. And I know you're going to mess that up. And that's why Jesus chooses of all the prophets, of all the images from the Old Testament, that could be a sign, like, what's your favorite story, Jesus, from the Old Testament? Well, it's Jonah. That's what Jesus does, in terms of meaning. We're talking about history and meaning, and and you have a story that gives meaning, like a fairy story, like great stories that we like to tell. about the world, the earth, and everything, and people, Wuthering Heights or Pride and Prejudice, whatever, the great stories that illustrate the way people are. That's meaning, and Jesus has his story that he says, I want you to learn from this, that this is the sign that's going to be given to you. And it's obvious that, I mean, I think from looking at the text that we just read there, that he referenced Jonah more than once, because here that it looks like there are two as they call pericope, there are two passages that are joined together, because of the one is talking about a sign, and the second bit that comes afterwards, the Queen of the South will rise up in judgment, and because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, something's greater than Solomon here, and the people of Nineveh will rise up in judgment. So they're figures of judgment from outside of Israel, the Queen of the South and the people of Nineveh. So it's a different topic. It's not to do with a sign. It's to do with figures of judgment who got it right, who are not Israelites, and they're going to rise up as in judgment, which means the marking of the line of truth, the line of meaning, where you will understand finally where the truth of God is. So there's a different subjects there. It's not the sign, it's the Queen of the South, and it's the people of Nineveh. So it looks like there's two different sayings that be united in the tradition, because they both to do with Jonah. So Jesus talks about Jonah on more than one occasion. And also there's other evidence as well from the crossing of the Sea of Galilee, when there was a terrible storm and Jesus was asleep in the stern. And the disciples say, are you not concerned that we are perishing? It seems to imitate the story of Jonah, and it seems to parallel Jesus and Jonah. So there's this kind of Jonah thread in the Gospels, which show that I think that Jonah was mentioned by Jesus more than once, and it was a sign for him. It was a model for him of the way he should go. So if you're thinking about Jesus in those last episodes of his life in the temple and doing that incredible thing like stopping the temple, he'd prepared for it by understanding that he had to go the way of Jonah, which was to go into the depths in some fashion, to go to the place that no one else wanted to go. The depths of the ocean, which are the symbol of chaotic violence, even God in the Old Testament doesn't seem to be able to control too well. There's some kind of battle there between God and, at least in some of the ancient traditions there. So Jesus, what I'm saying is that Jesus, by having this model of the prophet that is a sign, he's already putting himself in that space whereby once the authorities come after him, he'll already be prepared to go through with that that extreme situation. I mean, Jonah is in an extreme situation, a totally extreme situation. That's probably the best extreme situation image that you could get, and Jesus adopts it and then says people repented because of that, and that's the sign that you're going to get. People will change because of what I'm going to do. Now, just to conclude there, the sign of Jonah is so, as I say, he's not a cool looking guy. He runs away, he's in a bad mood all the time. He brings about the repentance of an enemy city, an enemy state, etc., etc. Jesus, the fact that this is there in the gospel, and it's so unlikely. Again, it demonstrates to me that this is authentic from Jesus. This is Jesus's own mind using the figure of Jonah to unfold his own pathway, which we have already described, coming to an end there in the action in the temple. So it shows a coherence. What I've argued today is a coherence in Jesus's pathway in the Gospels leading up to that action in the temple. One is a rejection of John the Baptist's violence, and the other is the model or the meaning of Jonah. What is your take on all that? That there's this continuity. I mean, does it seem legitimate to you that you can draw this pathway in Jesus's mind, his thinking, his intention, and his action?
Well, it's clear that Jesus carefully picked out Jonah to follow, because Jonah was a result. His preaching resulted in the saving of people, and Jonah himself was saved from the depths, he was 3 days in there, as I recall, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the Bible records that Jesus was 3 days and then he was raised. So there's a lot of parallels with Jonah and I'm not sure exactly what was in Jesus's mind, but I knew that he sensed the nonviolence of Jonah and was contrasting that with the absolute violence of Elijah that people were expecting from the Messiah in his day.
Right. That's right. Thank you, Jerry. So that I think builds up a pretty convincing portrait of what Jesus was doing. And, as Dana was saying earlier, that it seems pretty plain there on the page, but we haven't seen it as plain as before, because our Christian mindset has been modeled, has been structured by the whole atonement thing, that God had to be paid a debt, and that's the way we've understood Jesus, just simply as a physical sacrifice. We've not understood his own pathway. And I think, if you say he's human, he has to have a pathway. We all have a pathway, It's not necessarily a good pathway, but we certainly have a pathway, So Jesus had to have a pathway. If he was human, he had to have a pathway. And I think we have quite a bit of evidence in the Gospels to reconstruct it. And that's what we've been doing. And it's a pathway of nonviolence. Go ahead, Kathy. And then Jerry. Kathy.
I'll make it short, Jerry, because you're much more in depth than me. I just think you've really helped me, Tony, a lot. I've really have been enlightened by your, bringing us along today. Every day is really, that you lead us, is very interesting and profound and insightful. But to see the human side of Jesus more as he was going through this process of his purpose on earth.
Right.
I just thank you for that.
Why, Kathy, if you don't mind me asking, why would that be important?
Well, I've never I've looked at through the lenses, I'm sure Jerry and Maggie and whoever, like attending a Presbyterian church, learning, the gospel according to Augustine or whatever,
Yeah, right. Good. You nailed it there.
We have our beliefs, our platform, and I've never really thought, I thought of Jesus as a Godhead, it's the Trinity, it's the Trinity. But I always kind of thought of Jesus as like he knows everything that's going to be coming ahead, and I just feel that you can identify the humanness of Jesus. You identify with more the way you're presenting it.
Right.
It's the true compassion that Christ has. You see, as a man, a heart, the big heart,
Yeah, right.
even more so the way you are leading us.
Yeah, right.
And
Absolutely.
emphasizing the nonviolence, which I never associate with Jesus anyhow, but the violence that John the Baptist is looking for.
Yeah.
I always said to my mom, when I first became a Christian, I always said to my mom, I go, why didn't they believe Jesus? Why didn't they believe he was the king?
Yeah, right.
That God was sending him to be our savior. And she's, well, because it wasn't what they expected a king to be.
Right.
That simple.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
Good old grandma.
yeah. So Jerry, you go ahead. I'm sorry to take so long.
Thank you.
Oh, well, all I wanted to say was that for years I puzzled over what's this sign of Jonah business. I just didn't get it. It was only when I was influenced by your teaching, Tony, that I began to see it, and you've reminded me of that today.
Thank you. Well, it's a beautiful thing. I mean, we have a picture here in our house of Jonah. It's not artistically, it's not brilliant, but I love it because it's such a powerful image, of the prophet crying from the depths and then saved from the depths and changing people's hearts. Okay, guys, thank you so much, and love and blessings to all. We'll see you again next week, and I think we're finishing the passage, the chapter on Jesus next week. Thank you. Love you all.